Welcome to CxO Stories, our series of conversations with senior leaders about the real journeys behind their careers. At Eatonbridge Partners, we spend our time working closely with C-suite and board-level executives across transformation, growth, and complexity. What we're always fascinated by isn't just the outcomes, it's the path that people took to get there. The decisions, the risks, the moments of doubt, and the turning points that shaped them. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Louise Welch, a senior supply chain leader and board member who has operated at scale, led significant transformation, and more recently transitioned into a portfolio career. Supply chain is a function that has evolved enormously over the past decade, from operational backbone to strategic differentiator. And Louise has been right at the heart of that shift. In this episode, we'll explore her journey, the leadership lessons she's learned along the way, and her perspective on building impact at enterprise and board level, including what it's really like to rise as a senior female leader. Louise, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Ross, and inviting me to be on the podcast with you.
Maybe you could give us a bit of an insight into your background and career to date.
So let's see, I started my supply chain career at PlayStation in a planning role when I joined there. The company was very small, and during the 20 years or so that I was at PlayStation, I saw my career essentially move as the company grew. I worked in the London office, head office, but I also got the opportunity to move to Madrid and work in the Spanish office twice. And then when I moved back to the UK after being in Spain for 5 years, I took on an EMEA director level role that was supply chain execution, but also a lot of systems work, SAP upgrades. And then the last role I had was a global senior director role that was more focused on transformation and change, big systems, integrations and implementations. So we rolled out S/4HANA across the whole company. People change as well, so delivering a new target operating model for the new global operations department. People, process and systems essentially, and just driving change and ensuring that what we were doing in operations was connected to the rest of the business. So I love that side of it because I got to meet lots of different people and talk to people and understand how everything fitted together. But aside from that, I also, outside of work, I'm a board trustee with a charity that looks after sort of education and social mobility for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then I'm also on a board for a not-for-profit. It's called Be the Business, which helps small companies across the UK with productivity challenges. I'm also a board secretary with my running club, and I'm also a volunteer and a run director with my local park run. So lots of different things that kind of come together. But I think that's what gives you different experiences and different perspectives, and that you can bring all of those to the fore when you're faced with different challenges or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. And shapes you as a person. You can
Yeah.
explore those things both sort of professionally and for personal interest and fulfillment, right? I think that's the point of this whole CxO podcast, is that we are wanting to see the whole human and how it shapes you as an individual, and how it also feeds into your ability to influence boards and teams within an organization. So thank you for that. When you reflect on your career so far, what do you think is the thread that connects it all?
I think there's a couple of things, and as I touched on briefly just now, I think languages is a big part of that, which I don't think I realised that for quite a long time. But obviously, when you learn another language, it's a form of connection. But it's more than just learning a language to order a cup of coffee. It's actually understanding the way that a language is put together, and even the way that things are expressed in that language. It teaches you something about the culture and the people. And I've always found that super fascinating. And I think that people thread is something that's gone through my whole career, like meeting different people, understanding different perspectives, their backgrounds, their points of view, and what that can mean for you and how you can learn from that and take that into the workplace when you're making decisions. And the other part is that I've always loved like intellectual stimulation. When I was younger, I loved doing logic puzzles, crosswords, all that kind of stuff. And I guess in the workplace, I need that intellectual challenge. And I think that's why working in supply chain is so interesting, because it's rare that one day is the same. You've always got some sort of challenge that you're dealing with, whether it's macroeconomic things like Brexit or tariffs or whatever it might be if you're in a global supply chain. But I think both of those things have always been present in whatever I've done. And as when you reflect on it, I think that's what I know. I know that I need that sort of challenge, but I need the people connection as well.
Absolutely.
But I need to have the downtime where I can sort of get stuck into a difficult, meaty problem and work my way through that with or without people. I need both parts.
I can imagine also that the problem-solving piece with the puzzles and code and stuff like that is also really helpful in a supply chain environment, because process is so critical,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
You know, if you get the back end wrong, the front end is not going to work.
Yeah. Exactly, and it's a flow, like you say. Like the supply chain is a complete flow of information and data and processes and lots of different steps. Whether that's from the forecasting and the manufacturing all the way through to what you're delivering and shipping out. But it's the process, but it's also the system side of things.
Yeah.
Like I find that bit really interesting as well. The data, the governance, and how all the different systems connect together, and you're passing information back and forth. And that's, I think, when I look at my career, that's become far more important, obviously, in the last 10 years, where we're using systems way more, and look to the future now, and we're looking at AI and how that's going to, like, automation and AI is going to affect things. That bit I really enjoy as well. Just how everything connects across the businesses, not just with supply chain. If you're taking a big business, you're probably using some sort of ERP. You're talking to finance, you're talking to sales, you're talking to the tax and VAT people. Everything's connected, and you need to have that understanding, that big picture view of things.
100%. And you actually encaptured everything that a business is about, right? People, process, technology.
Exactly.
Straight away.
Yeah.
I studied languages too, as you know. I
yeah.
did French and Italian at uni, and I'd done Spanish for my A-levels and lived abroad a number of times. And I definitely noticed how much better I am at reading people as a result
That's
of
true.
me not being able to communicate with them in the way that I would have liked to whilst I was learning the languages. You have to read body language, you have to read like their facial expressions, you have to try and find a word that doesn't because you haven't got it in your vocabulary, that still gets to the same point. And I think you become a bit more agile in your communication skills, because you realize that it's not purely language. It's about tone, it's about body language,
gestures,
all of those
everything.
things. Yeah.
It's not one size fits all, is it?
No.
Because I remember when I worked in the Spanish office, on slight tangent, in the UK, British people were quite polite, right? So when you send an email, it's always like, "How are you? Hope you had a good weekend." When I got emails in Spain, it was like, "Louise, I need this straight away." And I was there for 5 years, and I realised when I came back to the UK, I had to change.
You're a bit direct.
Yes, a bit too direct. And it's that you learn that, though. You learn that self-awareness about yourself, and also what's appropriate for a certain situation or environment and what's not. And I think when you learn a language and you work overseas, or you're just surrounded by people from different backgrounds, you develop those skills relatively naturally, I think. You have to.
You absolutely
thrive,
have to,
to be able
because
to do a
if you're
job.
leading a global business or a global team, you have to understand cultural nuance to ensure that if people are saying yes, they're not just scared of saying no.
Exactly.
And if they're saying yes, they're not just pretending that they've done it and then are quickly just ignoring it in the background as well. And there's it's really important to grasp that quite quickly, isn't it? When we've been speaking, and you've mentioned how your husband is a coach, and we've talked about like planning your career, and I've certainly not planned mine. I've luckily fallen into a great business and a role that I really like to do, but to your point, I was studying languages, had no idea what I wanted to do. And you mentioned before that you didn't follow a sort of strict long-term career plan, and instead you took opportunities as they arose. How did that shape your career, and what advice would you give leaders who, and not just leaders, but people who feel pressure to have everything mapped out?
It's a really interesting question, because I can't say what my life would have looked like if I hadn't have operated, like if those things hadn't happened the way they had in my career. I didn't have a plan to start with, much like you're describing for yourself. I didn't know what I wanted to do, fell into things, and luckily, like project management, planning, all that sort of supply chain things, like was very much where my skills were. So whether that happened by chance, I don't know. I think entering a big business or a global business that was growing gave me lots of opportunities, and meeting lots of different people, being very open. And my route may not work for everybody, right? So I think it's very much down to your own personality. But I think when I was always talking to people anyway, and finding out what was going on. And as soon as I could sense that I was getting itchy feet, maybe subconsciously I would start to like widen those conversations and find out more, and like let people know, oh, I wouldn't mind doing something different. And then those opportunities would come along and I would grab them. Like I said, that was possibly subconscious. But I do think that having a plan as you're progressing in your career is probably some sort of a plan or some sort of a vision is a good idea. I don't think it necessarily needs to be that rigid. And for me, actually, I think the way I look at it is more that you have clarity on what the values are that guide your choices and your decisions. So the things that you need in a role or an environment, and if you can have that clarity and know what they are when you're making those decisions, you're doing it through that lens.
Mhm.
Then I think that for me has been more important. Um, and I think sometimes we're taught that your career has to look like a ladder, which I don't think is true at all. I think you can take what maybe initially look like sideways moves, but actually you learn a lot. So like when I moved to Madrid for the second time, it was a step up, but it wasn't a huge step up. But if I hadn't have taken that role in another country and got that exposure to a different market and met different people, I probably would have struggled more in the EMEA role because I hadn't had that sort of in-country experience. So you never know where things are going to take you. So I think being open is the most important thing to opportunities. And if you do have a plan, not letting that rule your life and feeling like you have to stick to it. Like it's just a plan and it can evolve and it can adapt. And I think that's the most important thing, that if you have a plan, you don't then become blinkered and like lose sight of opportunities that could be there just like around the corner that might be great, but just aren't what's on your plan at the time.
I think there are some really key points within that. You suggested that you were talking to people all the
Yeah,
time. That those opportunities didn't just land on your lap,
that's
did
true.
they?
No.
They landed with you because you were engaging with people in other areas
Yes.
and you were kind of looking around.
True.
You weren't
Yeah.
just blinkered in the role that you were currently doing. You were
Yeah.
understanding what opportunities could present themselves to
Yeah.
you. And by making those connections with people, you were more front of mind than somebody else within the business
That's a
because
good
they
point.
could see
Yeah.
the substance that you were bringing to the role that you were currently in. And potentially you'd alluded to the fact that you might be open
Yeah.
to talking about something else.
I, I think one thing that I didn't do earlier in my career that I think is something that is really helpful, and I think happens a lot more now anyway. Like, I think when I started out, having mentors and sponsors wasn't really a thing.
Mhm.
Um, but I think as a female in potentially in relatively male-dominated industries, it can be very helpful to help raise your profile. And so later on, when I did have someone like that, I could see the difference it made. Someone that when you weren't in the room would be able to speak for you and like highlight your achievements when maybe you weren't there to be able to do that. And I think I would encourage anybody like starting out to just find someone that you can talk to, have as a sounding board, because I didn't really have that anywhere else in my life. And I think actually it's really helpful just to give you a different perspective and someone to just bounce ideas off of and that may have been there and experience what you have, and so they can give you some advice and tips
And advocate you.
and advocate for you if they're within your business. Absolutely. If you're in a bigger company where there's all those meetings are happening and those conversations are happening about promotions, then they can be that voice in the room for you when you're not there.
Absolutely. I also remember us talking about that sort of the planning piece when it could be more important at different stages of your life. So,
Definitely.
for example, when you're younger and you are sort of starting out, actually to be able to pivot into different things is going to be quite critical. Whilst
Mm.
you're, especially if you're like us and you didn't necessarily
Yes.
have a specific goal about your direction of travel. So, to be open to moving or to segueing into a different department, or finding out that there's a connection with somebody that is inspiring you and sort of wanting to progress yourself because you know that that person would advocate you and you could learn a lot from. That openness is quite critical at that earlier
Mm.
stage. I definitely noticed that people who are at the more advanced stages of their career, it's really helpful to have more of a direction of
Mm.
travel, or a goal that they're looking
Definitely.
to achieve. Because, say, for example, a chief supply chain officer wanted to become a CEO or a COO,
Mm.
actually, you need to understand where the gaps are so that you can fill those and
Yeah.
take those opportunities that are enabling you to achieve that goal.
I think that's true, because I think it's just you have less of a career to go as well, right? So you probably do need, if there are certain things you want to achieve and you've got 10 years or 15 years as opposed to 30 or 40 years, you probably need to be more focused on what that looks like and the steps that you're going to take to get there. I also think that once you're a little bit older, you have a lot more clarity about what you do and don't want to do. And so I think it's far easier to be laser focused and say, no, that's not the right thing. And these are the steps that I need to take.
I think that's a really important point. You sort of know yourself better by that point too. So you're able to more hone in more easily on the things that fulfill you or that will bring you whatever it is that you're striving to achieve there.
Definitely. But I think if you're looking at your career like more how I am now as a portfolio, then to your point, it's about going, are there gaps? Is there something that I want to be doing that I'm not doing? So I think you do need to be more mindful or like approach it in a more with more of a plan, I guess, behind it.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think but I think for me that shift has almost happened quite naturally without me even realizing sometimes. Maybe living with a coach helped because they kind of ask those questions over breakfast that maybe if you didn't live with a coach they wouldn't ask you. But I think it's true, like later on in life, if you have got like a specific aim like that to become a CEO, that you need to have a plan and you
Yeah.
need to have the right people around you to help you get there as well.
Absolutely. I think it also depends on what those drivers are. If it's fulfillment or money,
Totally.
they are quite different
Yes.
routes that you might take.
You understand, like you say, you know yourself, you know what drives you and what matters and the difference that you want to make at that point, but also the environments that you want to do that in. So it might be that you want to be a CEO, but you could go and do that in a relatively small charity where there isn't that big corporate pressure, but you still get to have that breadth in the role. Or you maybe do want to be a CEO in a massive company where you're going to earn more money, but have a lot more pressure potentially. And I think it's both of those things are equally right, but they're just not the same. They're not right for everybody. So it's
Absolutely.
just understanding what's right for you at that time as well.
Yeah. And just going back to that kind of nuance and
Mm,
subtlety, you've led complex supply chain organizations at
yeah,
real scale. What does leading at that level require that people often don't see?
that's a really interesting question. I think we talked about it before. I think supply chain is a bit like finance. It's one of the back office functions that when everything's going brilliantly, no one notices you. But often, we're like ducks with our feet below the water. You don't see what's going on. I think
Swans.
swans, swans. Thank you.
Just think you should do yourself more justice. You're a
Swans.
swan, not
No,
a
I know you're
duck.
right. I'm a swan. I'm very, very elegant. I think for me, it's the breadth that people maybe don't see. So, like in supply chain, like as I alluded to earlier, you talk to so many different people and departments across the business, whether that's finance, sales, the commercial teams, leadership, IT, and engineering and infrastructure, as well as your partners and vendors, because you're obviously working with lots of different warehouses and all the different suppliers that you work with and the customers. So for me, supply chain, like on a complex project, is a bit like an orchestra. You're pulling all of those people together, and if there's a problem or something goes wrong, like we alluded to, like a Brexit or tariffs get introduced suddenly, and you have to respond to that, it's being able to pull those levers. And so it's the relationships that we talked about. So knowing who to call on at the right time, and that they will help you and support you, but also provide good advice. It's knowing how you can not necessarily cut corners, but where you've got a process where you can maybe shorten that. And with that experience in a bigger organization, that's super important that you understand that. And then just motivating your people as well to understand how they need to act and where they need to focus, because you can't make those assumptions when there's like a huge project going on. You've got to give people that guidance and not direct them necessarily, but sort of, well, maybe sometimes you do have to direct them when there is a big problem, but you have to kind of align, get everybody on the same page, and then just make sure they're all moving in the same direction. So it's everything, and I think when it works well, people don't realize that because it should look relatively seamless.
I think that what I've seen with people struggling potentially to make the step from kind of middle management to leadership, like true leadership,
Yeah,
it's that lack of genuine enterprise-wide reflection, influence, understanding that enables them to think of a business problem. They're thinking in a
yeah,
silo,
that's
and
true.
that can be quite limiting.
I think I think your point around stepping up from being a manager to more of the leadership role it's really quite hard, and I've seen it. Like I think I went through it. I think most people do, because it's almost like you don't want to let go of what you're known as being the specialist or the expert in, whatever that might be, systems or a specific process. But you have to take that step up and let your people be the subject matter experts, and you need to trust them. And then your role is bringing all of that together, like orchestrating all of that, and then but also asking the right questions of people. So you do need to have an understanding of the detail, but knowing when to dig into that at the right point, just to make sure that, oh, okay, yeah, with that analysis, have we considered this, this, and this? And hopefully your team will say yes, and but you trust them to have done that. But you can ask the right questions, and then make sure everything's pulled together. But you have to take that step back and see the bigger picture. Your job isn't to be in the detail anymore. But it's a hard shift to make, I think, initially.
Absolutely. And, interesting because when you're talking about that understanding of the detail, that is critical to be able to have enough of a substance to know that it's true or not, or what to do about it. But I can imagine that you moving into different board roles, you've never done those types of things before. So there's an element of actually how much do I need to know and how much is it actually around me, and like asking the right questions,
Totally.
speaking to the right people, and making judgments.
That's true. Because obviously, after I was at PlayStation, I took an interim role for 9 months at Castrol, part of BP, and I knew nothing about oil and gas. But you realise very quickly, to your point, Ross, that actually it's people, process, systems, exactly what you said earlier, everywhere, and it's how those three things work in harmony. And 9 times out of 10, I think the biggest challenge is communication. Um, People make assumptions around what people know, or there's a not a fear, but I think people are sometimes don't know what they can and can't share. So then it's like, well, I won't say anything, and that's the bigger thing. So it's knowing how to ask those questions and to unearth things sometimes. And I actually think when you come from a different industry, sometimes you can almost see those patterns more
Absolutely.
easily
Yeah.
because you're not using assumed knowledge like you might when you've been in an industry for a long time. You have to ask what seems to be the silly questions because you don't know. But actually, sometimes by going back to something really simple, back to basics, you can make everybody else take a step back as well,
Yeah.
or help them to sort of see things how you do and go, oh, okay, why are we doing that, or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. And supply chain has historically been male
Mm,
dominated. I
yeah,
say historically. Um,
probably still is a little bit.
well, it's the function that is second only to CEO for the poorest representation of women at
I didn't know that.
C-suite level.
Wow.
So only 6% of chief supply chain officers are represented by females, according to a recent Gartner survey. So there's still, as much as there is good representation at middle management and
Mm,
below, it falls off the cliff later
yeah.
on. Were there moments where being one of the few women in the room shaped how you led or how others responded to your leadership?
It, it's a really interesting question because I thought about it a lot. I think when I was earlier in my career, I didn't think about the gender piece as much. I noticed that there were very few female in the senior roles across like the board level, particularly say at PlayStation. Um, I think I only noticed it, became more aware of it as I progressed, and you realised that you were becoming there's less and less females, and to your point, like so often I was the only woman in the room in meetings. But it wasn't that it bothered me as such, but it did make me think about how I wanted to be seen as a leader because it's really hard to be what you don't see already. And I think that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me when I realised actually you just need to be yourself and you need to lead with the things, the values that are important to you. And so for me, that was being just very open and not transparent's one word, I think, just being very genuine about the way that you approach things and the way you talk about things. And I think when I started to do that much more, people responded to that. And it was really interesting. You almost have to take that step into a position of vulnerability and go, well, this is me. This is how I'm going to be. You know, you're not there to make friends, but you want people to hopefully be inspired by you and to follow you and to learn from you. And I think when you are doing that from a place of like passion and what matters to you, people see that.
As long
Um,
as you portray it authentically. That
yeah,
is that authenticity piece, isn't it? It's knowing yourself well enough to back yourself.
yeah, 100%. But it's hard to do that when you don't see other people doing that. And I
Absolutely.
think it, at PlayStation it was pretty male dominated, and there was a certain sort of way of behaving. So when you step outside of that and do that for the first few times, it is scary. But I think you have to trust yourself because you're there for a reason. You've been put in that role. Someone's trusted you, and then to a certain extent. I think it's up to you how you manage and lead your team and guide them. And to your point, if you're doing that authentically in a way that matters to you, people will see that and they will follow you.
But what we want to see is more people talking about
Yeah.
those experiences so that they can validate the behaviors that they emulated at the time and feel that it's okay to evolve. It's okay if you've had to follow that kind of path and then you think, actually, that doesn't feel authentic to
Doesn't
me
work anymore.
anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely essential. We look at the leadership traits that existed 10 years ago compared to now. You need to evolve in business because times change, generations change.
I think all
We were
change.
talking recently, weren't we, about the sort of now as a director and a board leader, you've got potentially kind of 5
Multiple
layers
generations.
of
Yeah.
demographic in there, and they are completely different from each other. And that's just an age thing, let alone all of the different other criteria that come into play. And so actually, evolution is critical to ensure that you are performing well as a business, because as we know, the more diverse boards and the more
Yeah. You avoid groupthink. If everyone's got the same background, then they'll all, like, in theory, validate each other's perspective, right? Because they're comfortable that person looks like them, thinks like them. But actually, if you've got different people, gender, age, race, everything, you're more likely to come up with a more robust solution that's better, to your point, for the business.
And we were talking yesterday about the Gucci example,
Oh
weren't
yeah.
we? Tell me more about that, because it was fascinating to
Also,
hear.
I think to your point about learning, we're all learning, whether you're in a junior position, a mid-management position, or a senior position. The whole point is that you're still learning. We don't know everything, and I think that's the main thing, is staying open and staying curious. And I remember, I think it was 3 women at PlayStation. One of the girls, one of the younger women in the group, was saying how she would love to get involved in understanding how the board at PlayStation worked. And it reminded me of the example of Gucci, who, when they were struggling, I think maybe like 10 years ago or more, and their board was obviously mostly senior people of a similar background and age, and they were struggling to work out how to respond to their dip in the market. And they created like almost like a reverse junior board made up of 20 and 30-year-old employees, who they used to come up with ideas around how to connect with the market, and who, like, almost to look again at who's our target market, what's our position in the market, and all of that. And that, like, shadow board of younger people came up with an awful lot of ideas that I think Gucci have since credited them with, for their, like, success in the last sort of 8 to 10 years, because they repositioned themselves based on the feedback from people that are much closer in age and profile to their customers. And I think that's super important, because you can lose sight of that, I think, as you move through your career. And I think it's that whole thing, isn't it? Speaking truth to power. Like, you move up the pyramid and you get further and further away from people. So it's like, how do you still stay connected and making sure that you're understanding what's going on the ground? And that sort of shadow board of younger people seem to work really well for them. I haven't heard of many other examples, but I think it's an amazing opportunity, because for the younger people to get access to the way that their board thinks, but also for the board to have an opportunity to hear from young people, to hear their ideas and perspectives as well. It's
Absolutely.
fantastic.
And even if you weren't involved in that shadow board, how inspiring to know that your business is open to doing that type of thing,
Amazing.
and it would
100%.
motivate you to step up and grab new opportunities,
Totally.
surely.
Because you think, well, my company are open to not anything, but they're very open, and so you never know where that can lead. But you're
Absolutely.
right, it's very inspiring.
Yeah. And removes any need for a plan.
Possibly.
Now that you're working in a portfolio career on a number of boards, you're
Mm.
doing some really interesting consulting work. You're also doing supply chain activity as well. What do you think future C-suite leaders need to cultivate earlier to be truly effective in the boardroom?
I think it touches a lot on everything that we've talked about so far, how as a leader you need to be constantly learning and evolving. And I think that's the thing. Nothing's standing still anymore. The pace of change is growing faster and faster. So I think it's incumbent on leaders to make sure that they're able to deal with that, but also to make sure that they're providing the people that they work with or alongside with the support and, uh, not necessarily framework, but the ways how to cope with that, and being able to see how everything fits together, that big picture piece that we've talked about, that helicopter view, taking that step back and thinking about context and where you can pull levers. How that all fits together is super important. And you can have a process, you can automate things, you can use AI to answer questions, but it can't add that layer on top. And that's what, as a leader, I think is going to become our sort of superpowers or our strengths, that you've been there, you've lived that challenge. So then that when you're faced with it in the future, or a similar version, you've got that muscle memory and you can pull on that. And AI can't do that. It can give you sort of data and say, hey, yeah, you need to do this. This is what we would recommend. But I think we always need to take that with a pinch of salt and add like that human layer on top. And I think as well, like with I know we haven't really talked about it, but with AI, these large language models, as I understand them, are based on all of the information that's out there: journals, research articles, studies, etc. And as a female, my understanding is that a lot of those are obviously heavily male biased, because that's historically most of the authors or the objects of those studies have been more male focused. So I think as the workplace shifts, and as it should and does become more diverse, is AI going to represent that fully? Because it's pulling on past data, historical data, but actually, as we're talking about, everything's changing. So I do think as humans, that's what we need to bring in, that extra layer, to make sure that what it's presenting to us is that what we want to provide as a solution or as an outcome? Is that how our business, we want our business to look or to act? I mean, that's just my view, because who knows? It's changing so quickly.
It is.
But I do think there's an awful lot that we need to think about, all the bias that's involved in AI.
I went to an event last week for International Women's Day with the Albright Future Steps event. And I heard this terrifying stat that 25% fewer women are using AI, and that could potentially drop as it develops further. Because we have fewer women in the workplace at sort of more senior level. We also have this kind of risk appetite that sometimes plays out with confidence and interest. And if we don't do what we can to support, global usage of AI, that bias could potentially get worse. So actually, that training and support and encouragement of anybody using AI is absolutely critical to ensure that bias gap reduces rather than increases.
You've got an ERP, SAP, or whatever ERP you're using in your company. You would never just let somebody loose on it without training and guidance and a tutorial, and to sit down and maybe shadow somebody. So why isn't it the same with AI? And I have seen, like, in some companies, they do it really well. Like when I was at BP, they were fantastic. There were so many training sessions to give people confidence, to your point, open to everybody around the globe, from like really entry level stuff to how, like, what a prompt is and how to write a prompt, and all of that. But you've got to give people that support, because otherwise, who knows where they're going to go. But also, if you're the leader of a company, you want everyone pulling in the same direction. And if everyone starts to use AI differently and in different ways, you're just going to end up with a huge, like, panorama of different solutions and different things coming out of it, but they're not aligned and coordinated. And we spend so much time in a company, like, making sure all of our systems are joined up, and yet it doesn't feel like I'm sure there are some companies out there doing really good things, but you don't hear that many stories of people that have really understood the benefits. And I think that's the thing. If you put an ERP in your company, you spend the millions of pounds saying we're going to implement this new system, and it's because it's going to fit with our business strategy and it's going to solve these problems, and the ROI is going to be fantastic. Well, it's the same with AI. Like, don't just use it because everyone else is using it. I'm going to jump on the bandwagon. How's it going to help us? Like, is it going to fix a business problem, or actually, is it going to almost make things worse, because you're going to get your employees to do something in AI, then they're going to have to check it. Then we're going to have to, like, review it again to make sure. I don't know. It's a really interesting question to see how it plays out.
The AI piece is fascinating, isn't it? And it will be fascinating to see how it plays out, because at the moment it's the control bit that is under scrutiny, right? There's ad hoc maverick usage of it all over the place, with people putting contracts into their phone, ChatGPT personal account, and how that plays out in business is going to have to be more aligned with the overarching strategy of how the business works and the policies that they have around the governance elements. But actually what we want to do is feel like it's an enabler, not yet another process that we have to follow. And how do we explore that in a way that, to your point, solves a business problem rather than just because everybody's doing it. And our clients, we're seeing a lot with a lot of our clients where there's a really different sort of maturity level around understanding of AI as well. So some are coming in at genuinely entry point where they're saying, like, we know that we have to do something about it, but we don't know what problem we need to solve nor what solutions are out there. And then you've got others who are right at the other end who are almost becoming, you know, digital businesses because they can now, because of AI, and they don't need an office and they don't need people. You know, there is and everything in between that. And it will be fascinating to see how that plays out with leadership. But I think, to your point, what's beautiful about all of this progress is that actually the human influences and experiences are critical to ensuring that it's fit for purpose, and that there is real opportunity for people to explore things in a new and different way whilst remaining authentic, human, and adding the additional stuff that a large language model just doesn't offer.
Just can't do. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah. We'll see.
We'll see, I know.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was a really nice conversation. I really appreciate your candour and your insights, and grateful for you to participate in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope this conversation has offered not just practical insight into leading at scale, but also reassurance that even at the most senior levels, careers are rarely linear, and growth often comes from stepping into complexity before you feel completely ready. Thank you for joining us for this episode of CxO Stories. If you enjoyed the conversation, please do share it with your network, and keep an eye out for future episodes as we continue exploring the real stories behind today's C-suite leaders.